Indigenous leaders are shaping our future, socially, economically, and culturally. First Nations and Indigenous-led organizations are invested in real estate development, individual businesses, and resource sector projects. These organizations are utilizing legislative venues open only to them, and in doing so, they are pushing through the clutter, increasing the pace of approval, and delivering permits where cities and municipalities face challenges. And First Nations are working to steward the environment with programs and principles that protect our province and celebrate their unique relationship with the land. Leadership is a key element to these success stories. The vision, energy, and persistence of individuals leading the way. Hello, I'm Stuart McNish, and you're listening to Conversations Live. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series addressing the big issues of our time. For each episode, we bring together subject matter experts for a deep conversation designed to provide you with information that helps you make more informed decisions. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Conversations Live, Indigenous Leadership. On May the 16th of 2024, I recorded an interview with Nilo Edwards of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. Following that interview, he and I sat down and set a date for tonight's Conversations event, which is focused on the vital and needed role of First Nations leaders that they are fulfilling right now in the development of projects in British Columbia. Here is a clip from that interview with Nilo. Arav, can you roll that clip, please?
A role to play in attracting that capital in terms of making an informed decision about partnering on those projects with the private sector, because that partnering element has a de-risking factor to it. And it signals to the market as well that where there is Indigenous partnerships, there are also higher ESG ratings and better project planning and more rigorous standards, because that's what our members expect from operators within their territory.
Sadly, we lost Nilo in December, and so we are dedicating this episode of Conversations Live to Nilo Edwards, his leadership and vision. I also want to extend our condolences to the Wilson family. Hereditary Chief Bill Wilson was instrumental in reshaping Indigenous rights in Canada. He left us on January 25th. His spirit remains with us now and will forevermore. The Right Honourable Lieutenant Governor Janet Austin wanted to be here tonight to deliver opening remarks. She unfortunately was unable to join us. She expresses her regret in not being able to be here. She did, however, record opening remarks for us. And Arav, could you play those remarks from...
Good evening, friends. I'm honored and proud to address you on the eve of the conclusion of my term as your Lieutenant Governor. The distance we've traveled during the past 7 years includes remarkable changes in our relationship with First Nations. 7 years ago, we were still learning to understand the potential that the Silcoteen Supreme Court decision would offer. Today, we're witness to and partners with First Nations throughout BC who are seeking new opportunities to benefit their communities. In doing so, they're addressing a wide range of challenges that our province and municipalities are also grappling with. Countless Indigenous entrepreneurs are filling product and service gaps and creating partnerships to address challenges in natural resource and real estate development, with potential to help alleviate our housing crisis. As Indigenous peoples develop their own systems of governance, legal and governance interfaces with other jurisdictions will need to change, and existing institutional structures will be challenged to evolve. Adapting to new ways of working and interacting requires patience and persistence, and there will be pressure points ahead. Our challenge is to help all British Columbians understand that this is fundamental to the work of reconciliation. It is much more than a legal and moral imperative. It is a strategic investment in a more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable future for all Canadians. Boosting economic growth, innovation, and the sustainability of resources and environment, and building social cohesion and long-term stability by reducing the potential for social and economic disruptions. I want to thank our panelists this evening for their leadership in this critical work, and all of you for your sustained support for the work that lies ahead. Haitchkasiyam. Good evening, friends.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge that we are coming to you tonight from Kemkemale, the place of many maple trees. These are the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, who have lived on and continue to call these lands home, Osium. Tonight we turn our attention to an issue that is of great importance to me. I was first made aware of the historical relationship between Indigenous people and the Crown when I was doing research as a young reporter for a TV series about the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en land claim case back in 1989. While doing that research, I learned of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which spelled out what the relationship was supposed to be between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. It was supposed to be one where we were cohabitants of this land. Prior to working on that series, I had no idea about the historical relationship between Indigenous people in Canada and the Crown. There was nothing in my education that gave me any history or perspective. I have spent the past 36 years learning, and I still have much to learn. In an interview I recorded with Senator Murray Sinclair a couple of years ago, he spoke to the changing nature of the relationship between First Nations and governments in Canada, as well as all people in this country, how we treat one another. RF, can you please roll that clip?
I think institutionally, the way that our system of government relates to Indigenous people and governs the lives of Indigenous people is the fundamental change that we need to address, but also the way that we talk to and about each other is an important change that I think we're just beginning to develop some sense of comfort around.
That interview was recorded in 2020, as you saw on the screen. Since then, I think, well, at least I hope, we have made progress. Tonight, we are looking forward to the evolving and expanding role Indigenous leaders are playing and how their leadership will play an ever-increasing role in the way we move forward in British Columbia. Tonight, we're at RBC for our in-person panel and audience, and we're live on the Vancouver Sun. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series that seeks to advance our understanding of the big issues of our times. Our goal is to share ideas that help each of us gain a greater understanding of our communities. We are only able to bring these events to you in person and live online thanks to organizations that support programming for engaged citizens. You will see the logos and names of these organizations scroll across the bottom of the screen throughout the evening. I can't thank them enough. That's why I'm going to give them all a shout out. We have two special event sponsors tonight, TEC and the Mining Association of British Columbia. Our hosting sponsors are RBC, KPMG, and Macmillan LLP. Our annual sponsors are BD Developments, Stem Cell Technologies, Rennie & Co., Landlord BC, Pacific Salmon Foundation, TC Energy, Fortis BC, Polygon, Digital, Helijet, TELUS, and Marquee Wines, which is generously contributing gift certificates and a corkscrew to each of our panelists tonight. You will find those sitting next to your coveted Conversations Live mug, which you get to take home with you. Our supporters are BCIT, OPI, Falkirk Consultants, and West Coast Reduction. And we work in association with Apogee Public Relations and Research Co. As I say, without the generous support of these organizations, this program would not be possible. One last bit of business. For anyone wishing to submit a question that we can present to our panelists, whether you're in person in audience here or online, please go to slido.com, enter the code Conversations Live, and send in your questions. Sean, who's down at the other end of the panel, he's our Slido master, will receive your questions and share them with the panelists. Now, just before we get to the panelists, I want to introduce you to Mario Canseco of Research Co., who did a poll that shows that the attitudes towards Indigenous leadership and self-determination in British Columbia are incredibly positive. Arav, can you roll that
Residents
video?
of British Columbia are keenly aware of the benefits that self-determination has given to First Nations and Indigenous communities. More than 3 in 5 British Columbians believe that the ability of Indigenous people to determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development has been positive for Canada. Favorable responses on this question outnumber unfavorable ones by a 5-to-1 margin. Fewer than 1 in 10 British Columbians believe First Nations and Indigenous organizations are doing worse now than 20 years ago after pursuing their own economic, social, and cultural development. Still, the views are not universal for each sector. While 2/3 of BC residents believe the cultural situation is better now than 2 decades ago, only about half feel the same way about economic and social matters. An important component of economic reconciliation is the opportunity for First Nations and Indigenous organizations to make choices without outside influence. At a time when BC residents are increasingly concerned about housing, almost 2/3 think Indigenous communities should decide what type of developments can be built in their territories. In addition, almost 3 in 5 BC residents would take the same course of action on natural resources. A story that has been featured prominently in the media across British Columbia as an example of First Nations and Indigenous organizations reclaiming their rights is the Seneca development spearheaded by the Musqueam Nation in Vancouver. In spite of social media commentary suggesting that the construction of 11 towers and 6,000 housing units is controversial, almost 3 in 5 BC residents are supportive of this new development. For Conversations Live, I'm Mario Canseco from Research Co.
What I find remarkable about that poll is I remember the response in British Columbia in the early 90s after the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en case had been appealed and went to the Supreme Court of Canada, became Delgamuukw. The initial response to that was, oh my gosh, we have no idea how we're going to move forward economically. And today we hear people going, the majority of people going, this is the right direction. This is good. Our panel tonight and video contributions that we have that we'll be playing bring together representation from throughout BC. Our in-person panelists are Christy Smith of the Haisla Nation. Crystal, thank you. Chief Derek Epp of the Musqueam Nation. Derek's down at the end there. Christy Smith, Senior Vice President at Falkirk Environmental Consultants and a member of the Comox First Nation. Ethan Clarke, the co-founder and CEO of Nations First Technologies. Catherine Pennington, Director of Indigenous Advisory Services at KPMG and a citizen of the Métis Nation. And Stephen Lee, the CEO of Musqueam Capital Corporation. So Christy, I would like to start with you. You know, in that clip that we played from Senator Sinclair, he spoke about the way governments speak to First Nations, and he also spoke about how we all speak about and to each other. Do you think we're doing better in that way, in a way that we accept, appreciate, and respect one another and our insights in leadership?
I guess my short answer is no, in some ways. I think in other ways we're doing better, and in some ways we're still stalemated. I always reflect back on what the late Honourable Murray Sinclair had stated in respect to the mountain and that pathway up to the top in respect to reconciliation. And I think if you were to look at that and look at individuals and companies and other aspects, you're going to see a whole different level depending on the person or the company at hand. I also think when he talks about respect, it's not just respect between government and Indigenous leadership. I think we need to look at respect from Indigenous nation to Indigenous nation. And I think there still remains work to be done, especially in BC.
Crystal, I see you nodding. What about Christy's remarks make you go, yes?
The comments about the Indigenous community to Indigenous community. There has been existing, I guess, controversy in between our communities when it comes to the contact and what was established for us to be set apart and essentially fighting amongst each others when it comes to territorial boundaries, which never existed before contact. We lived amongst one another, actually traded and helped one another when it came to any type of commodity that we could extract from our territories. For our territory, Haisla territory, it's the Ulukan. And from the coast, we're very well known for what we refer to as Ulukan grease. That commodity was traded in what we refer to as the grease trail. Those issues never existed prior to contact. And our communities need to do a lot of work in terms of getting past those, especially when it comes to the territorial boundaries that are unfortunately drawn on a map.
Steve, maybe you can address this, because if we take a look at the partnerships and relationships between Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, it would appear that you are moving in a harmonious manner.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. First of all, thank you for having me on the panel, and I'm proudly here to represent Musqueam. And so the partnership with MST came about very organically. I think that was in the days when when accommodation was still a big thing with regards to the federal government, the provincial government on Crown lands. And it was the vision of the leaders of the past and present to really say, well, we should get together and hopefully optimize our position with the government, because they want nothing more than to fragment us. So how do we do that, and how do we blaze a trail, if you will? Took a lot of work, but at the end of the day, I think the vision was there, the desire was there, and therefore what followed was we call it a protocol agreement with regards to land. And from there, that's when we started in terms of how can we improve each other's communities in that regard. And really, it comes down to a mindset. It comes down to a will, because as Chief had pointed out, historically there has been some us and them, and that was pitted against us with the colonial wrongdoings and so on and so forth. But moving forward, I think that was the strongest indicator, is the will to do it.
So what initially had to change for Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish to start to move in a direction where, rather than being pitted against one another, you were looking at working together?
Exactly, and I think what we saw in front of us was the opportunity, and from that, it really is about any relationship. It's about building some trust based on common ground, right? And once we found that, we were able to move past any legal obstacles or business obstacles. So really, I think the buildup of trust and the fact that we're working together for the betterment of each of our communities, as opposed to the empirical way of this is us, this is you, we'll get what we can and you get what you can. So a lot of that came from the political vision.
Yeah. Catherine, you, I'm sure, experienced this quite a bit. What is the way in which you work with your clients to help them start to navigate these waters that will bring them together rather than create barriers?
Well, I think first I would just acknowledge that, historic government protocol, the intention behind the colonization was to create conflict between individual nations. And so that unfortunately, has lived on. And I think that also continues to fuel historic challenges and current challenges that we face. So that was the first thing that I was thinking about the importance of communities working together, but I can imagine that there are many current systems that make it very difficult to do that. In the context of the work that we do at KPMG, it's focused on how do we help solve problems and help clients maximize opportunity. So working with parties to understand what their interests and their positions are, and help to often interpret between industry and government and Indigenous communities to find that commonality and the common ground. We're usually closer together than we are far apart, and there is inherent wisdom. And I think that the medicine and the magic is in the community. They often know the path. It's the method of getting there that is so important, which involves that listening and creating a space to come together. And I think that that's part of what we can do to work with communities and government and industry effectively.
Derek, you are in, just so you know where Chiacton First Nation is, tell us where it is, but you are in a region of the eastern Fraser Valley where you have many First Nations neighbors. What are you doing to create working relationships with your neighbors?
First of all, how long do you have? Yeah, so Chiacton is kind of like an urban reserve in Chilliwack. So we're very strategically located. We have a very much advantage in a market where our reserve is, and we use that to our advantage. And we've been able to build our own economy on our realistically small reserve. We've, in about a decade, maybe 15 years, we've flipped our own script from 90% dependency on government funds to 90% own source revenue, and we'll never say that we're dependent on any federal transfers. And how we've done that is through building our own economy, but we've had to be selfish along the way, and that's part of the reality. But part of what I've done over the last decade is really trying to integrate that traditional governance system. Chilliwack has about 9 First Nations communities touching the boundaries of the city of Chilliwack, which poses a lot of challenges, but also I see that as an opportunity. So what we've done is really try to amalgamate and looked at the MST and looked at some of the other larger reserves or groups who have come together to try to look at economically benefiting. And we're taking what we've done at Chiacton and now trying to translate that onto a tribal base. So the Chilkoyak tribe is a makeup of 7 Indian Act bands. So really we're trying to come together now, and really some of the successful things we've done in the last couple of years is expediting something called the Additions to Reserve process. Now that took, typically, as chatting with Stephen, it can take anywhere from like 3 to 30 years to do that. I did it in 6 months, which was unheard of. It's been something that is transformational for my community. It enables us to provide opportunity for our members, for the local Chilliwack community as well. We're going to have about 10% of the city of Chilliwack's population on my little reserve in the next 3 to 5 years. We're going to be providing public institutions, you name it. But what happens with that is we need the support of the surrounding First Nations to actually expedite these processes. So it's been a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting. As the other panelists have said, sometimes it's really the toughest politics to get through is our own. But it's really about having that conversation, that dialogue about who we really are. When I have a name, Wilelik, it's not from Chiacton, it's from my tribe. And that really grounds me in the work I do and in making sure that it reminds me that I'm doing this not just for Chiacton, but doing this for the greater good, for the ancestors that paved the way for me. And we try to remind ourselves as leadership in our governance systems of really who we are, and making sure that we are stronger, we're better together, we can participate in the economy better together, and we can capitalize on a lot of these opportunities. We were joking, it's not drinking from a fire hose anymore, it's actually drinking from the fire hydrant with all the opportunities you have. And really, if we can come together to access these opportunities, I think all of our communities will benefit, and eventually, hopefully, get to a point where my community is at, where we are self-determining, we are economically self-sufficient, and we are able to invest in what we deem as our priorities. So it's a shift, and it takes time. I'm not going to say it's going to happen in a year or 2 years. It takes several leaders in that commitment to continue to push it through, but it's exciting, and I think the future is really bright for a lot of our traditional governance systems and who we are, and a lot of our individual communities. The opportunities are there.
So, Ethan, you have gone and co-founded Nations First Technologies, and you're not operating in silos like one nation versus another. You're working across a broad spectrum of nations. How important is it that we start to see organizations like yours that can now play a role of, yes, you're providing a service to one First Nation, but then you're talking to the next and the next and the next, and you're starting to build networks.
Yeah, so one of the recent sort of initiatives we've taken on, it being in the technology space, I'll give kind of a little bit of a background. Essentially, we create what's called a blockchain. It's like a decentralized ledger, and it's owned by all the users of that ledger. And so sort of what you see happening is a lot of decentralization, a lot of people that are able to now actually own all the assets without having somebody else own them for them, hold them for them. And so when it comes to engaging more people, I've always seen sort of an opportunity to really incentivize people to take a part. And so what we've done is essentially create a way to manage resources as a community, distribute opportunities as a community, and actually have people own those assets, right? And the thing about blockchains, it's totally transparent, it's totally accountable. So, the resources go where the communities say they're going to go. There's no way of breaking that, and thresholds have to be met where the community says they have to be met. There's no way of breaking that, and so there's ways of essentially attracting that investment, managing resources, not just as an individual, not just as a company, but as multiple nations, multiple tribes, multiple organizations, in a way that's much more sort of technologically advanced, and really just integrates and streamlines that entire process. And another thing I might just add to that as well is really the importance of engaging the off-reserve population as well. I think it's something that's often really left out of the conversation. Despite being 80% of the the population. I myself grew up off-reserve for about 20 years. Not once did I hear from my band. Not once could you really engage with your community. Obviously, it's something that without engaging that population, how can we really move forward in any sort of meaningful way? So, and then of course, really improving these lines of communication within the reserves is something important. Even living on my reserve definitely was not a welcome home when I decided to move back. Definitely was fought to be home, and even that, we hadn't had a community meeting in over 20 years. I think we just had our first one, or they're arranging our first one on February 13th. And so I think when it comes down to community governance, that becomes super, super important if we're going to be managing relationships with other nations. My community is a small community, very, very small, 120 people. And so in one like ours, I think, really having everybody on the same page, including the off-reserve population, is sort of that first step. And, it's easy to look at a lot of the other nations, the larger nations, and use them as sort of an example of, we're moving forward and, things are great. But, I think with many, even in British Columbia, especially in British Columbia, having so many different First Nations, really taking a look at how to unite a lot of the smaller ones. I'm in the southern part of the island where, there's at least 5 First Nations very close to each other, very small, that don't really have, and that's very cool to hear about what you guys are doing. But, in a lot of our communities as well, it's very, very behind. And so, being able to organize at that level, I think, is important moving forward.
So, Ethan, give a little bit of a sales pitch about exactly what the software is. You talk about blockchain, but it's specifically designed for First Nations. And in what manner does it help the First Nation and then, as you say, off-reserve populations that is specific to this software, and why it was important that it's a First Nations technology company that developed it?
For sure. Yeah. So essentially what kind of blockchain is, it's a very decentralized technology. Again, everybody owns it. Everybody within the network owns it. And so that's true sort of data sovereignty, right? You own all your data, you own all your assets. There's no way of anybody else holding it, which I think is really the important thing. I think there's a lot of, so-called economic development initiatives, environmental, development initiatives that are putting more resources back in the hands of sort of the same institutions that have sort of put us in this place. And so having a technology that allows you to really be sovereign in your ownership and in your data and in your information is very important. And then when it comes to decentralization, again, there's no middleman, there's no overarching person that owns the network, and so there's no one person that can maybe steal or I guess corrupt the system or can lead the system without the community approving of it. Furthermore, again, it's a distributed ledger. Everybody has access to the ledger. Everybody can see where resources are going. Everybody, can manage those resources in a totally distributed manner, which of course creates a lot of opportunity for, things like AI and ML that allow communities to leverage each other's resources on that network. Which is an area that we've seen a lot of traction recently, and how do we get these nations and tribes in the States to sort of develop initiatives in the mining sector, leveraging the resources that they have in ground to sort of kind of recreate almost like a trade and bartering system, but super juiced up on tech.
And focused on First Nations.
And focused on First Nations, absolutely.
So, Arav, I'd like to introduce a video clip that we have here from Doug Slater at Fortis BC, because it'll move us into our next topic.
We cross 150 different traditional territories in the province, and we serve 58 First Nations directly. And so for us, working with First Nations in their territories is critical. We build lots of linear infrastructure that crosses territory, so it's really important for us to build long-term, authentic relationships.
The Mount Hayes LNG facility near Ladysmith is one such example, isn't it?
Well, the Mount Hayes LNG facility was conceived of and constructed around 2011 and 12, and we developed a first-of-its-kind equity partnership model with the Cowichan tribes and the Stamanis First Nation, who own equity in our facility. And so that was a really beneficial partnership that allowed us to, build that facility and partner together and both benefit from that facility.
Oh, that equity piece is quite important, isn't it?
It is quite important, and this was 2011, 2012. So it was, one of the first of its kind, and a really important step for us at Fortis BC that's led to other partnerships and other thinking. For us and our parent company across North America, as we really think about how do we partner and what are the models that can work. We're seeing First Nations that are like the Squamish Nation, that is an environmental regulator for our Eagle Mountain to wood fiber gas pipeline project. We're seeing, in the news, we've heard recent announcement this week. We got Indigenous-led energy projects being advanced. It really is a changing time, and I think it just really signifies that we can do more together. And we're seeing the benefits of that.
So, thank you, Doug. That brings up a couple of issues: Indigenous-led and equity ownership. And this is where we're seeing significant changes. Stephen, I'd like to go to you. Musqueam Capital Corp, you are forging paths forward where it's your leadership, but it's also your equity that gives you the authority to be able to start to build out projects that fit with your values, but also meet local needs.
Yeah, exactly. And for us, much to what Doug was speaking about, we do have a relationship with Fortis. But to your question, Stuart, for us, I think we progressively manage risk along with our investments. So we'll never step outside of our box. I mean, we have our mandate. We have to manage our risk. I told the chief, I promise I won't screw up 9,000 years worth of history. So, having said that, we take a very measured approach to some of our projects that we'll take our development projects. We will partner when it's right, when we have the structure properly represented. But before that, we'll try and walk the path with them in terms of, we may do a land lease, for example, on our development. We may just do a prepaid land lease to take some risk off the table, but commensurate to that, what we'll do is we'll start talking about what does a modified equity look like. And from there, we'll go to 50-50, and then summarily we'll end up doing self-performance on a lot of these projects. So it's a very measured approach, which meets the mandate of our nation and our community, if you will, in terms of managing risk. But at the same time, it's always, the trajectory is always moving forward in that regard. So it's a measured approach.
Derek, I see you nodding away there.
Yeah, we stole that from Musqueam. We take the very
You're not going to hide that.
No. Well, yeah, we started in the 90s, actually. We had to trick the system in the 90s. The Indian Act system didn't allow First Nations to economically benefit from the reserve land base until land code, essentially, or until there were some changes to the policy through Indigenous Services Canada, or whatever you want to call it, DISC, ISC, the name changes every couple of years. But in reality, we tricked the system. So we worked with a very progressive developer. We leased it to them for $1. This is our first shopping center we did. We paid for all the bricks and mortar to have the thing built, and then they leased it back to us for $1. So it was pretty much a way to work around the Indian Act system until land code and the jurisdiction we had. And that was so instrumental in what we do now today. That shopping center was integral to the residential developments, to the high density that we have, to the other commercial aspects of our reserve land base. And now we take a very similar model to Musqueam. It's, we make those decisions if we want to be full ownership, equity ownership, or even with we have a 50-acre development coming down the pipeline as well, hopefully amalgamated and maybe getting more land to do a larger scale one. We're doing a very similar approach where some we may lease out to gain back some capital. Others we look at an ownership model that, and working with progressive developers as well in looking at, okay, well, once we pay back that equity to the developer, we want to own 100% of that asset, because we know what comes with that is the lease rates, is the taxation, because we're very much a progressive taxing First Nation as well, and that's a lot of our bread and butter and what we do is. So it's really that same methodical approach and looking at projects, going through the modeling, making sure that if we don't have the capital, who do we partner with, and how do we get in this model where at the end of the day we still want to have a major equity stake. One of the other hats I wear is now, I was the deputy chair, now the chair of the First Nations Finance Authority. So we're over $2 billion in loans out to First Nations across Canada now. A lot of it is looking at supporting, it started with looking at supporting small infrastructure projects. And now I won't steal the thunder of one of the other panelists, but we do a lot of work and now looking at the economic projects. If you heard of the Clearwater deal back east, with the Micmacs, a massive fish industry that was about a $250 million loan from the FNFA, and along with other bonds and equity ownership models. And that in turn, you see what that's done to that market back east. They've had the most profitable couple years because the First Nations are owning it, are making the decisions with the company, and actually rolling that forward. So, it's both from that micro and that macro level. Those are two kind of examples of what equity can do for First Nations, and really supports the ongoing. And we use a term called Tamiak in my territory. It means, taking the knowledge from 7 generations before us and making sure we're planning for the 7 generations ahead of us. So that's something that we always keep at the forefront of everything we do. And what do you need to do that? Money and equity.
Stephen, I know that you wanted to jump back in, and Crystal, I saw you anxious to make a comment as well. You're keen.
I was just going to add and contextualize to what Chief Epp was talking about, is that in our case, given where Musqueam's at, we're an urban First Nation, and our land base is relatively small compared to some of our rural cousins. But that being said, when I talk about risk management, when I talk about partnering, it has a lot to do with land tenure. We both deal with on-reserve lands, which is within our land code, but we also deal with off-reserve lands, and we started getting into acquisitions. But those, as Nilo had said in his opening, in the opening video, it was a way for us to de-risk by partnering with seasoned developers and trusted developers, so that we were able to partake in off-reserve land acquisitions as well to broaden the portfolio. So, thanks.
You mind if I play one more video before we come to you, Crystal? Is that okay?
Oh, go right ahead.
Yeah, and it's because, Derek, you brought up the Indian Act, and the Indian Act is still with us. We have a clip from Sharon Singh from Macmillan LLP. Arav, can you play Sharon's number 2 clip?
It's not just a legal phenomenon. Of course, you reference, many will reference UNDRIP and DRIPA implementation. It's a social and economic phenomenon that is driving what I will term as, in another term, economic reconciliation. And in terms of the opportunity, there is a plethora of examples out there around equity ownerships by Indigenous communities in projects. And it's not just passive equity ownership. And frankly, many exploration projects in mining have equity ownership of First Nations because the easiest thing to give away is not cash, which is tight, it's actually your share. So in essence, there's equity. But what we're seeing is governance equity. And that is where nations are having rights on how projects get built, how projects go through engineering and FEED and all those other studies. And that is different. And so in terms of the opportunity there, it opens up, and you've heard the criticism, it takes too long to get projects built. And it does. And we've gone from, a relatively, I would say, average environmental assessment process to something I won't call best in class because it's not, but it's meant to be. But we've swung the other way too much so in an effort to ensure that we're meeting the public interest. We're satisfying the distrust that existed on environmental assessments. And I think that's where the opportunity lies, along with the equity ownership piece, is also for nations to rise up and say, this is exactly what we need to build our public trust in this project or in this process. It doesn't need to be the 1,200 volume page, and that's exaggerating, of course, but it's not far. The plethora of reports and multi-year studies that needs to be undertaken, we actually need this. And in an effort to reconcile both the speed to market, which we need to get projects in, as well as advancing economic reconciliations, there's the equity piece. But as part of the underneath the equity piece, there's also the governance and the regulatory piece that I think is right now the missing opportunity. The equity piece is, I think you will hear many people talk about, and it's there, it's emerging. There is more advances in terms of access to capital, more education around those. But what's missing is the innovation on the regulatory front, because that is going to be the barrier that will prevent some of those aspirations from getting realized.
Arav, I directed you to the wrong clip, but it's a very important clip. And it's relative to Crystal and both Catherine in the work that you're doing. You've got Cedar LNG that you're moving forward with, and this is an Indigenous-led natural resources project. How have you managed to be able to pull this together from a leadership perspective, both within your community and then to make it work on the provincial scale?
Wow.
Easy question, I know.
Like Chief said, how long do you have?
Yeah.
Take the whole time. First of all, I was here about a year ago, and we were in the process of building the momentum for Cedar LNG to make a positive final investment decision. And it was supposed to be in December, and then it got delayed, and then it got delayed. And we finally did it. We announced a positive final investment decision in June. I still get goosebumps every time I say it. 10 years in the making. It took 10 years. And I was very fortunate to be a part of the beginning stages of talking about Cedar. It was in a room in Calgary where this idea came from, negotiating 400 MMCF of capacity, which is our largest impact accommodation, a part of our impact benefit agreement with LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink. And our team was successful in envisioning that ownership. And that was the key component. Why doesn't Haisla own it? And the works essentially started. Hello, Jay. Sorry.
Hello, Jay.
So it essentially started from there, and our team started doing the work. First was all the support and active advocacy for LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink to get to their positive final investment decision, which Cedar completely hinged on. And then after the announcement of their positive final investment decision in 2018, then the work, the real work started for our nation. And I'm one of the last original Cedar board members. And when Sharon's video is playing, as she started saying that's the missing piece is the governance portion and the equity and major ownership piece, I'm saying yes. Because we were the first ones, Haisla board members of Cedar, were the first ones to make the decision about the technology, about the facility, and how we were going to perform in our territory. We've had many experience with other development, major development that we had nothing to do with. We sat across the channel and watched a development of an aluminum smelter, a pulp and paper mill, a methanol facility, with no say. It destroyed our territory. That Ulakan that I was talking about is no longer existing in some of the rivers in Kitimat. So we vowed to perform above any expectation that we held any other proponent to, because it was our own. There was no way that our leadership were going to stand up in front of our people and present a project that was detrimental to our territory. The floating facility, air-cooled versus water-cooled, those were all decisions that we made in the best interest of our territory and our 7 generations out. And then we got to the point where we had to invite proponents in to do essentially an RFP process to bid on whether or not they would be chosen to be our partner and come along with us on our journey of building Cedar. And I remember I had a few meetings this week where I actually remembered that process. And we had one proponent sit in front of us and tell us, your technologies cost too much money. The being powered by hydro, if you change the technology to be gas driven, you'll make this much more money. We saved about an hour and a half to 3 hours for each proponent to come in front of us and tell us their proposal so we could ask in-depth questions. That proponent lasted maybe 20 minutes. I remember looking at our leadership and our lawyers and our team of experts and said, we're not moving. I looked at our other leadership on the table and said, are you willing to stand up in front of our community and present this? No. I think we're done. The proponents got up, packed their briefcases up, and left. We will not budge on it. We would not budge on it. And essentially, we worked very hard. We signed a partnership with Pembina in June of 2021, which I think in terms of that project, I don't think anybody really thought we were going to be successful. I think at times we even doubted ourselves to be successful, to be honest. And then we signed with Pembina, added complete legitimacy to the project with a company signing on with an Indigenous community like Pembina Pipelines. And we got it to where we're at today. And we would not be here without the support of our people. And you talk about, he didn't want to steal my thunder, but we worked very close with the First Nations Finance Authority through this process. And there were stipulations within that funding for us to engage with our community, which I lost many sleepless nights. Our whole project depended on it. So we had to do a community referendum. And as leaders and chief councillors, we go through a lot in our community about the worrying of what our people, the expectations. But I tell you, I think I lost about 5 years off of my life in those few weeks. We did in-depth engagement with our community. We held many sessions online, coming down to Vancouver, meeting with them, going over the presentation, answering any question. in those types of meetings, you generally get some feedback. You say, okay, I'm writing it down, I'll go back and I'll get the answer and then I'll respond to you. In these meetings, we said nobody's leaving without their questions being unanswered. And overwhelming support. Over 90% of our people voted in favor of that. And we took that as we are going on the right path. And our people understand the next evolution of what our involvement in economic development is. And then we brought it to an FID.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, yeah, give her a round of applause. I mean, it's remarkable. Yeah. Catherine, in the work that you do, you work with many First Nations, and we have over 100 First Nations in British Columbia. Not all nations are the same. Not all nations have the same appetite. But what model does the Haisla provide for you in helping to work with nations that are starting to say, yeah, we want to move in that direction?
Well, I think what Crystal said some really crucial points there that stood out for me. The first was the determination about what was on and what was off. And there's an intersection between the community wisdom and the opportunity. And my sense is that that is a significant milestone that really changes the opportunity from community leading versus community being brought along. So I think that is something that really stands out. The other is the vision about what the opportunity is going to bring once the opportunity is in service. And I always think about things in the context of community, children and families out front, and how do these projects help communities, children and families in the future, not only for this generation, but the multiple generations to come. And I know that that is a shared vision of Crystal, and I would imagine also of Chief Epp and many others here in this room, that when we think about the actions that we're taking, do those projects create significant economic opportunity? And what might be significant for one nation may not be for another, but it's significant to that nation. Does that create jobs? Does that create healthcare? Does that create elder centers? How does community health end up being elevated because of the steps that we're taking today? And I think that when we start with the end in mind, which is what we're taught as Indigenous people, then quite frankly, we make good decisions. And there's that wisdom that lives within the community that helps to guide that. But for so long, Indigenous people not being on the forefront of major projects, of any project, of any governance, meant that there was not an opportunity to have any influence. Standing in Kitimat, looking across the bay and seeing all of the activity that is directly impacting you, but you have no say, control, or custody over, is no different than many nations across this country that have had similar experience. So I think it is, the times have changed significantly, and leadership across this country and in this room have shaped that. And I guess to start with the end in mind is what comes up for me.
Christy, in a conversation that I recorded with you and Mike McPhee, I naively went, well, of course, all First Nations want to move in this direction. And you went, whoa, not so fast. And so what are some of the barriers that some First Nations go, yeah, that may look attractive from a distance, but I'm not so sure?
Yeah.
And then how do we, continue to work with those nations to say, well, what do we need to be able to bring to you to help you realize that with economic prosperity that there can be benefits to the community?
I think I was just reflecting on the comments of Chief Crystal Smith and the concept of like what's okay and what's not. And when we're talking about equity, we're also needing to look at the aspect of wealth. And I kind of spoke about this last week in a different conference. And wealth doesn't always mean money. And wealth to a nation could mean a multifaceted approach to an opportunity. And a lot of times when we do look at economic opportunities and we do make money, and we have the governance ability to bring that money back to our community, we're putting it towards things like social programs, cultural programs, getting back onto the land, which a lot of us have been removed from. So I think that is a fundamental piece that needs to be considered, is that not everybody and not every Indigenous nation is going to have the same concept of equity and wealth and what that means to them, as we are individuals. And wealth for me and myself is making sure that I have health in my family, and it is 7 generations out, and I'm doing everything for my great grandchildren. That's important to me. That's wealth. But equity is a piece of that, and equity is an important governance piece to that, so we can obtain the wealth the description of what it means to ourselves.
Thanks. Sean, I see that we've got a question here that has a fair bit of support. The first question, can you share that with the panel?
Thank you, Stu. We hear great stories of First Nations overcoming a challenging colonial history, but also nations that are still struggling with addiction, poverty, and poor housing. Why are there still have-not nations today?
It's a bit of a brutal question, isn't it? Because it exists. Derek?
Yeah, I guess I can take the first crack at this one. Yeah, it's a tough question, and a lot of it is location. A lot of it can be location. That's probably, in my experience, is probably one of the biggest factors. You look at a lot of the panelists up here, and some of the success we've had is because of our strategic advantages that we have in where we're located. And not everybody has the opportunity to build 3,000 to 5,000 homes and sell them at the same market rate as you see in the city of Chilliwack like we do. Not every community has the ability to build light industrial parks or towers or create a tax regime that they can actually create sustainable revenue from. So it is, we see it all the time. You see some of the questions that we saw, even Mario, I think, was portraying is, it's ironic because, you see a lot of still the general society complaining that First Nations are dependent on federal transfers, but also complaining when First Nations are trying to be economically self-sufficient. So I always beg the question, well, what is it? Do you want us to succeed or do you want us to fail? And if it's the first, then support us. And there's got to be a lot of general support. And I think it goes down to a lot of the location disadvantages, but it also is there still has to be those tools. So, part of, like I mentioned, a lot of the work that I do is in these First Nations institutions. It's the Finance Authority, the Tax Commission, the Infrastructure Institute, the Financial Management Board, and the Lands Advisory Board. That's where I play politics. And so a lot of it still, though, we have limited tools in our toolbox. So even what we've been able to do for my community is with a shoestring of what every other government has the capacity to access. And those tools need to be opened up to its fullest. The next advocacy that I'm a part of is expediting and speeding up the addition to reserve process so that all nations can create urban reserves that can then, instead of some of their location disadvantages, they can create urban reserves in the cities. That's happening in Winnipeg right now. Wob Canoe is doing some fantastic work in Winnipeg in supporting some of the Indigenous communities who are rural and don't have those advantages to being able to access land and buy back traditional territorial land and add it to the reserve so they can begin to prosper. And that's fundamentally what I think is going to shift a lot of these communities, is speeding up these processes and actually opening up the toolbox. One example is, we tax. We do property tax, property transfer tax, development cost charges, same thing as any municipality. We function the exact same. 75% of that tax has to go back to the city of Chilliwack. Do they earn that? I don't think so, but that's the reality that we actually face right now. We should be keeping more of those revenues. One of the other revenue streams is called the First Nations GST. Right now, if it's on reserve, if you collect that taxation, if you make more than $1 million in GST, the feds keep 95% of it. Like, tell me that's right. You can't physically tell me that's right. Why are we being hindered to succeed? And at the current time, the feds don't even collect the tax. So they're not like they're actually benefiting from it, as is, but they're going to actually hinder us if we're actually being too successful. So that's like two very quick examples of some of the realities that we still face. Yeah, we do have some economic tools, but it's still not robust enough in order to help support the communities who are the have-nots. We have a community like Chiacton, and you could drive 10 kilometers and you're at a community who still has boil water effects. And that's in the heart of Chilliwack, who still doesn't have city septic and city sewer, who still has serious environmental contamination issues, but they have 42 members, 150 acres. It's not really, something that their members can live on or reside on or prosper on. And they have challenges that I would never imagine that our community would face. But the reality is they're doing the best with what they have. And they have to be able to open up that box, that economic toolbox, in order to really take the strides forward. And you'll see the impacts. You look at the local economic impact. We do about $500 million a year in economic impacts. That's job creations, that's housing, that's income tax, that's stuff that the government really actually is benefiting from us now on. So really, if you open up that toolbox, you're going to see the have-nots being able to start to make their way up. And it's going to take several decades, but they have to have the tools in order to actually start to close their own infrastructure gaps to help support their kiddos and their families from not having their kids in care. One of the things I'm most proud of is we have no more kids in the care of the ministry, not one. And that's something that took a lot of effort, a lot of investment, a lot of money. But that took our own capital, not the government's capital. That took our own investments in our membership. That took us hiring the right people. That took us investing in mental health programs, investing in our own social workers, because we couldn't wait. But that's the luxury that we have and not every other community has. So it's, yeah.
So you bring up an interesting point. You raised that at capital, you were able to make it work. Stephen, you're doing the same with Musqueam, Crystal at Haisla. Ethan, you're an independent business person and you're living on reserve. What access to capital do you have, and how important is it for you to be able to build out your company and provide economic opportunities for First Nations tech people working in the tech sector? Do you have access to that capital, and what would the difference be to you if you could get it?
I was in a meeting the other day, a bunch of angel investors, and I was pitching my business, looking for investment, and get a bunch of blank eyes second I said Indigenous and blah, 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 blah. At the end of the call, one of the guys, puts his mic on and says, "Why are you building for Indigenous people? Why don't you just build for the general population? You'll be more successful there." And kind of went back and forth and didn't really get it. And I think that kind of perfectly summarizes the investment space for Indigenous peoples. Of course, like you can see that in the numbers, less than 0.01. That's one of the higher numbers that I could find of venture capital money actually ends up in the hands of Indigenous peoples. And I think, not that I am a big advocate for the venture capital space, but it is an area that it is one tool that we could be using. And of course, you can see within the tech space as well. There's Indigenous peoples are massively underrepresented, and so I think that's sort of one of the things that I really started building off of years and years and years ago, was that sort of access to capital. Even within the sort of streams of finance that I could find, there was huge barriers for tech. I got turned down, dozens of times. Oh, sorry, you're in tech, too risky. And I think that's sort of an area that First Nations and Indigenous peoples could be advancing in, is finding better ways to invest. And so that was sort of, after years and years of experiencing that barrier and access to capital, I started building off of. And I think that, looking at, enhancing your toolkit is very important. And I find that there's sort of that lag with our peoples in terms of advancing in that space. So, we built, again, sort of back to decentralized finance, ways that you can use, sort of emerging technologies like tokenization, like blockchain, to be able to attract investment, and not only attract investment, but also be able to really audit that investment and see how money is going, if it's being used where it needs to be used, and also putting what's called a smart contract, essentially a self-executing agreement on those resources so they're actually spent where they say they're going to be spent. And then, of course, that really creates a lot more sort of security for for those investments. And also being able to raise from like your community, right? Like I think through the technology, you're able to fractionalize those investments, making it a lot more accessible. Which, one thing when I'm raising money, I'm very careful for who I'm meeting, who I'm talking to, who I'm raising capital from, because I don't want just anybody having that equity in the company. You come across some people and they don't exactly perfectly align. This one time we were sort of struggling to raise capital. We met with an investor, and he hands me this term sheet, and I look at it, and I was like, I wanted to send him a document of the Indian Act back because of what this term sheet looked like. It was sort of a partnership term sheet, but you guys can only go after Indigenous peoples. Like, you're only allowed to address this market, and we're going to address the broader market, and blah, 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 blah. All sorts of stuff like that, which was just crazy to look at. So
So access to capital becomes important to you to be able to grow your business.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I look at the economy not only in British Columbia but in Canada and think, you look at the reports that come from David Williams at BCBC, and he says we're sliding backwards. We become locked in process within sort of the general population of British Columbia. And I'd like to ask each of you, because I believe that First Nations have an opportunity through leadership to help unlock the economy of British Columbia and ultimately of Canada. Catherine, from your perspective, what unique leadership qualities or abilities do First Nations have that can propel projects forward that would otherwise become stuck in the mud?
Well, first I would say that I think most of us would agree that the lengthy process that is required for permitting and regulatory matters is extremely long. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. I think that was a reaction, that, as was noted earlier, to a system that was deeply mistrust. There was not trust in the system. And there's also been the implementation, of course, of DRIPA and other legislation that has made significant changes. And in British Columbia, the response to that was to amend environmental assessment process. That being said, I think that we're on a journey and on an evolution. And the next step in the process is most probably going to be Indigenous-led projects that will determine a regulatory regime that will oversee these projects and steward them into success. So from my perspective, the sooner that we can figure out that process and how the working together of those organizations, Indigenous organizations and government, can come together, the sooner that we will see projects move to the finish line, which will benefit all British Columbians and all Canadians.
Christy, same question to you.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think there's the aspect, and we spoke about this earlier, on wisdom. And there is wisdom that is ingrained in our communities and within our knowledge keepers and within our leaders that can help and lead a project to success. And I think without that Indigenous integration or in being Indigenous-led, I think we're missing a puzzle piece. So if you take a look at a puzzle and you got that missing puzzle piece, I really believe that the Indigenous perspective and aspects to a project, without that, we're not going to see the success in the coming future.
Stephen, what is essential to being able to generate income and influence the economy in a positive way from a First Nations perspective?
Yeah, again, just to add on to a lot of the comments that have been made, even with Fortis, for example. So we've got, Musqueam has strategic friendship, relationship agreements with YVR, with Fortis, with the Port of Metro Vancouver. So there's a perfect example, Stuart, in terms of the greater being is the movement of, like, for example, the port, the movement of goods throughout Canada, Asia Pacific Gateway, and so on and so forth. So we play a role in that. We play an integral role in that. And it's not always about the money that comes from that. And as it was mentioned before, wealth is measured in so many ways. It's really about the participation of Musqueam and the nations with regards to decisions such as the environment, such as YVR noise management as far as the expansion of the runway goes, and really just, it's a more holistic view on it as opposed to a simple days of accommodation or days of getting consent from the nations. So really, it's a win-win, and therefore it aligns the interests of the community with the project itself. To take that one step further, I mean, the port's going through a crisis, as we all know, of industrial land shortage in the Lower Mainland, and it's only getting worse. So we have built into our agreement in terms of how we can facilitate the freeing up of industrial land or the acquisition of industrial land. But not only that, we're actually in discussions with regards to being partners or acquiring those lands ourselves so that we can be a direct solution to that. So it's a holistic way of looking at how are the nations looked at with regards to being the solution to the greater problem, in this case, across Canada. In this case, globally, in terms of movement of goods and people. So again, if we take that view that it's not just the economic, it's the socio-economic factors and the cultural factors that all make it a well-received agreement.
So we're already over time, and I just get sucked into these conversations because I find them so engaging. But at the beginning I talked about the remarkable distance that we've traveled in the last 35, 40 years. And I'd like to ask each of you, where do you envision that we will be 10 years from now? Because I think the rate of change is accelerating, but I'm curious from each of your perspective, what will that look like? And Crystal, I'd like to start with you.
I think I got to answer this question about a week ago. In
2 weeks ago, yes.
2 weeks ago, Prince George. I mean, the vision is for more Indigenous active participation within the economy, more ownership of projects, and not so much based as individual communities, but ownership across value chains. And Indigenous relationships where we all prosper, where we all come together, learn from one another, learn the smart practices, and essentially move projects ahead. As Stephen alluded to, we are not a problem anymore. We never have been a problem. We're a large part of the solutions. And when you talk about taking into the environmental assessment process, as opposed to working and bringing a piece of paper to us and saying, I need this from you, sign it. Work with us to get to that so that you have the support from not only from our leadership, but from a community perspective. And you think about the work that, and LNG Canada came into our territory and completely changed the landscape in terms of how they were building relationships. Not one of their applications went before a regulatory body without our input. Every elder in our community were our knowledge holders. They told us and LNG Canada, you cannot work during this time in this specific space because of this cultural relevance. Work around it. And we found those solutions. We helped with the authorization of one of the largest fisheries authorization acts in Canada. And that had multiple meetings. I don't even know how many hours. But their success was our success. We're a solution.
Ethan, what does Nations First Technologies look like 10 years from now?
So one of our primary focuses right now is really like as mentioned in the previous video, regulation and innovation in regulation, I think it's very important, especially right now. There's so much happening around, the modern treaty agreements and different things like that. And in my mind, we have our relationship to the land, we have a relationship to the Crown, and there's over 200 court cases defending rights and title. I think that looking at ways to, uphold that through regulation and really having each nation, not band council necessarily, but each nation sort of creating their own regulation and being able to attract investment and uphold sort of their methodologies and their traditions through that regulation. So really mobilizing their rights in a way that sort of changes the way that we see wealth. That's something that we're really looking to do through like tokenization. There's no reason we need to dig up a bunch of gold, send it to China to be smelted and sit in a vault in Switzerland for the next 30 years. We can tokenize those resources, let them sit in ground, let them provide value to the ecosystem and attract investment and sort of maintain wealth that way. So 10 years from now, I think that we want to see this technology be used in industries that are very influential and important to our people, like the natural resource sector, in a way that really changes sort of the metrics that we look at for wealth.
And you'll be providing great employment opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. We're want to see a lot more people in the tech sector innovating there and changing the way that employment happens within the natural resource sector.
Catherine, what does 10 years look like from now to you?
So I first have to say that I am by trade a social worker and a counselor who's worked in industry for 20 plus years. So I always think about that and have to say that. For me, 10 years out, we're going to have Cedars, other Indigenous projects that are fully operating with revenue and profit and money flowing back into community that's going to make significant changes to social health and outcomes. We're also going to have other Indigenous projects moving forward in significant volume because the model has been set, because you can be what you can see, and that is going to shift the framework of our country. But more than that, we're going to see high school completion rates increase. We're going to see suicide rates decrease. We're going to see less kids in care. We're going to close the wage gap from 70% of a wage gap of those on reserve to those off reserve. We're going to close the 30% income gap for those who are in urban centers. So to me, the vision is very much about improved social health and outcomes because industry opportunities create own source revenue, which then creates wealth no matter how you measure that, social, economic, cultural.
Derek, you talk about the distance that you traveled over the last 10 years. What do the next 10 years look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Catherine, fellow social worker. Yeah, before this, I was a social worker as well, then did business school. So it's a nice compliment. Yeah. But you're right. I think, in the next 10 years, I think you're going to see a lot of the communities hopefully having the tools that they can to do similar situations and take on similar initiatives that we've been able to do. And I think that's going to empower the individual communities. But what I think more so what you're going to see is the collection of traditional governance systems being reinstated. The cohesion from First Nations and breaking down our walls, breaking down those silos that were entrenched from the Indian Act and the colonization process. It was very much the ideology of First Nations has been what's mine is mine and stay away from me because it's mine and I got to protect it. We're seeing a shift in that where a lot of the First Nations communities are like ours are opening up our toolkits, opening up all the initiatives, the policies, the procedures that we've tried to perfect over the last decade, and we're sharing that. We're working together, and I think you're going to see the have-nots starting to become the haves and starting to work collectively and impacting our economy on local, provincial, and national scales. You're going to see the true governance decision-making in resource projects. I think it's still Haisla is probably one of the only ones still right now that is actually a true governance involvement in a resource project. You're hopefully not going to see what happened with Trans Mountain ever again. You know, the inability or the inability to involve First Nations decision making is, in my opinion, one of the direct results of what's happened with that project. And now we see unique opportunities like Haisla and the different LNG projects are success stories in expediting the permitting process and expediting these barriers and risks to investments. You know, I'm heading off with Fred again to London in April to talk about the investment summit. I think, yeah, Crystal's there too.
Crystal's
with me.
going too.
Yeah, so, and really it's about that bridging that gap in creating these economies that are international now, that are more breaking down not only Canada's or not only our reserve boundaries or our provincial boundaries, but breaking down these international boundaries to investments. And I think you're going to see a lot of the First Nations are leading our economy in Canada. I really think that's going to be the shift. It's going to be us who are making these decisions, but we know we're doing it in collaboration with our partners and with local municipalities and local governments and provinces and our federal government as well, because you know, ultimately it's the right thing to do, and it's something that we have to continue to do, and we're better if we work together. And I think, I'll be realistic, it's probably going to be 20 years, but hopefully we can get it done in 10. But it's exciting to be a part of it.
Stephen, I can't help but believe that you have that same level of optimism and enthusiasm about the path forward.
And then some. You know, I'm going to start with the end in mind and the goals in mind, and which is really what our colleagues here have talked about. Instead of being lagging in every social indicator, we'll be leading hopefully at that point. But that's the outcome. What I really see happening right in front of our eyes is the fact that we're going to stop talking about economic reconciliation as a concept or a moral or business obligation. We're going to talk about it as mainstream. It's going to be embedded in the way we do business. Likewise, in terms of having conferences, in terms of how do you do business with Indigenous communities. Jokingly, I said a couple of years ago to Board of Trade, someone asked me, how do you engage First Nations or Indigenous for business opportunities? I said, if you don't know the secret handshake, it ain't gonna happen. Right? So after all these weirdos came up to me and started sticking their hands out, I realized that we've still got a long ways to go. But my vision for that is that we're gonna be mainstream, we're gonna be leading projects, as we said. In British Columbia, the nations are the leading real estate developers. We've got a pipeline of about 20 to 30 years of development in front of us, and that's without even further acquisitions. So we're well under our way. I think we just got to gather that momentum and keep that moving forward, and that's incumbent on all of us here.
Thank you. And Christy, we started with you. I'd like to wrap up with your vision of what the next decade ahead of us looks like, because you're both urban and rural resource development. You're everywhere.
Wow. Starting and ending, and after all of that was a privilege to listen to everybody's comments because they resonate so deeply with me. I can't actually provide much of an addition because I'm really an advocate for our cultural and social and economic health. But in 10 years, I'm an elder, and I am hoping that I'll be holding up our next generation that will be stronger, smarter, more culturally resilient in a space, and be sitting here maybe in the next 10 years with Stu.
We'll redo this. We'll come back and revisit your predictions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all of you for your remarkable insights, experience, and sharing with us. I want to remind you that you've got the coveted Conversations Live mug that you get to take home with you. And remember, there's a gift certificate and a corkscrew for you to, as a thank you from one of our sponsors, Marquee Wine Cellars. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the online audience. Good night. Thank you for tuning into Conversations Live, an Oh Boy Productions program. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find our previous and upcoming episodes at conversationslive.ca. You can also follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Again, thank you. I'm Stuart McNish.